This morning, again at North Hills Church, we return to Bible Stories I Should Know. We began this series last month and we looked at the created world and the beautiful creation that God has made for us. Then a couple weeks ago, we looked at the creation of Adam and Eve as recorded in Genesis 3, and we looked at their fall and sin coming into the world. And it's almost like rhetorically, the Bible asks now, is that all we're going to say about sin? Moving on. And the text does move on today to Genesis chapter 4, where we now discover that sin is not just going to be a problem for Adam and Eve, but also for their children. And incidentally, next week when we look at the flood, that will also answer the question, was sin only a problem for the Mr. and Mrs. Adam and Eve family? No, it's going to be the entire world, so much so that God will wipe it clean with a flood. More about that next week. But back to today's text. We're right to the point of the Bible where God has created people, and now in today's story, people create people. The first human being is born, Cain. And shortly after, a younger brother, Abel. And the storm clouds gather. Because Cain was a farmer, and when harvest came in, we're told that Cain made an offering to God. Please note that the text doesn't tell us why he went to make an offering to God. The text only says that he did. Maybe it was a bumper crop that year. Maybe he was thankful. The urge to worship and give thanks is pretty deep. Simultaneously, Abel, his baby brother, who was a rancher, also decided to make an offering. Again, the text doesn't tell us why. And we're told that just like his brother, he gave what he had of the fruit of his labor, and he brings a meat offering, being a rancher. Text doesn't say why, it just is. Two brothers making two sacrifices. This is not the problem of the story. The problem comes when both brothers go to church, where they witness each other making their offerings. Cain with his grain offering, Abel with his meat offering. But after church, instead of going out to brunch as brothers, Cain takes Abel out into the field and kills him. What happened between church and the field was God. Because we're told simply that God had favor for Abel's offering, but God did not look with favor upon Cain's. Now that asks all kinds of theological questions over the millennia. Why would God do that? Why would God show favoritism? And so many explanations have been offered up because we just simply have to find out why this was. Some say, first of all, was the problem with Cain. He brought grain while Abel brought meat. So meat might be a little bit more of a spendy, appropriate sacrifice. God prefers meat. That makes no sense at all to me because God instructed humans first to eat what? The fruit of the trees. All creation was equally beautiful and blessed. So we can't go with that explanation. So others say it's not what Cain brought, but the quantity. Cain brought some of the fruit of the field, whereas Abel brought some of the firstborn of his flocks. But you got to be honest, the text really doesn't make that a big deal. In fact, it almost argues the other way because both brought some, not all. So others move on to explain, well, then it must have been about the intent, not the gifts per se. Cain's heart wasn't in it. He wasn't genuine, but Abel was. By the way, this is John Calvin's explanation. But unless John Calvin had a heart-to-heart personal conversation with Cain, we can't confirm that explanation either, for the text simply doesn't say anything about anyone's heart. And of course, we're all trying to find an explanation for this because no one wants to believe that God would do this. show favoritism of one brother over another, one sacrifice over another. But the text is clear, and it's the first lesson today. Sometimes there is no good reason. It just is. The text seems to be brutally honest about life as we know it. We want everything to be fair and equal. We don't want to live in a world where bad things happen at random to people. Explaining this would give us a bit of control, and we would love this. So we tell ourselves that if we do our homework and work hard and stay out of trouble, we'll get a good job and be successful. And the truth is, some people do that, and that's true. But the other truth is that some people do all of that, and for some reason, it doesn't favor them. It's just not fair. I don't understand why. The doctor tells us to watch our weight, to do our exercise, to eat our broccoli, and we'll be fine. But disease still strikes with ruthless abandon. Why? How do you explain that healthy people get sick? It's just not fair. And I don't understand why. We want there to be reasons for everything. Equal input should mean equal result. Shouldn't it? But life doesn't always offer reasons for everything because sometimes an imbalance occurs with no explanation. So the text then goes on to tell us to live with some wisdom because sometimes things will be wrong and unfair and unjust, and there is something we can do about it. And when there is, we ought to do everything we can that we know to make it right. And sometimes things are just unjust and unfair, and there's nothing we can do. It just is. And in that moment, we need to learn to make peace with life, even when we can't understand it, even when it disappoints us. Some receive blessings that others don't. Some students just get it. It's an easy A. Other students are in the same class, hearing the same material. They stay up all night studying. They go over it with a tutor in the morning, and they still don't get it. It just is. Some people can do things with a hammer or a paintbrush or a computer. Some can't. It just is. No explanation is offered. Life is simply not the same for all of us. We may not like it, says the text, but it's unavoidable. Sometimes it's no big deal. Sometimes it can be deadly. And so now we have to go back to the story to see how it unfolds. Cain tries to find an explanation for God's pleasure of Abel's sacrifice, but not his. He can't, and it hurts. And so he blames Abel and invites him out into the field. And as we see in the story, we too may be tempted to blame the blessed for something they had nothing to do with. And we invite them out into the field. Our text doesn't explain life in God's world. It just describes the realities with one another. And it cautions us to pay attention when life disappoints us, because it's in that moment that God speaks. So God asks Cain, "Why are you angry? You're good. You can be accepted. Just do well and don't let this erode the good that is in you, because it is in this moment, right now, Cain, that sin is lurking at the door. Sin is trying to get you, but you can master this, Cain. Don't let this disappointment eat away the good that is already you and in you." Now it seems clear that God's interest is not so much in the offering, but our reaction to the offerings. And God says, "Cain, who will you be in this moment of disappointment?" When I was in junior high school at Pella Christian Grade School in Pella, Iowa, we were going to stage a musical production of Charlie Brown. Of course, there was a buzz all about junior high of who would be chosen to play the lead role of Charlie Brown. I mean, who didn't want to wear that yellow shirt with the big black zigzag on the front? Would you believe if I told you that both Mr. Slings, the producer, and Mr. Coy, the music director, both tapped me on the shoulder personally to audition for the role of Charlie Brown? They personally wanted me. The audition was just going to be a formality. I was a shoo-in. And when the cast list was posted outside the music wall on that cinder block wall, guess what? I didn't get the part. It was a cruel setup. And the icing on the cake, Charlie Brown went to my first cousin, Robbie Banstra. They offered me second chair French horn. Why did Robbie get the part? Because he could sing like an angel. So I settled in my mind first by thinking, I'll save face by saying to Mr. Slings and Mr. Coy, it's okay, I didn't want to be in your stupid musical anyway. And to Robbie, I wanted to say, let's go out in the field. Let's go out into the field. Because what I was doing was blaming him for something he had nothing to do with. I was blaming him for gifts that God had given him that God didn't give me. Disappointment does that to us. We blame others for things they had nothing to do with. And when we do that, sin crouches at the door. Life will disappoint you from time to time. It doesn't mean you deserve it. It doesn't mean you're rejected. It doesn't mean you're blamed. It's just the way it is. And what matters is how you will be in that moment. The one thing we don't want to do when life disappoints is erode the good which is already you and already in you. So do you see yourself in this story yet? Where's your face in the story? Are you with Cain the jealous? Maybe Abel the victim? But I even hesitate to ask that question of how to personalize the story for you, because then again, that only subtly reinforces the notion that maybe the story is about us. And I question that because now the story takes yet its third turn. For now, out of this murderous, dysfunctional family disaster of a mess, God will now emerge as the main character in the story. Yes, there will be consequences for Cain's actions, certainly. With blood still on his hands, he is banished to the land of Nod. Cain is sent into exile, away from his family and friends and life as he knew it. He's condemned to wander east of Eden in that lonely, shadowy land of Nod, whose name itself suggests that Cain will be a restless nomad for the rest of his life. He no longer sacrifices. Instead, now he comes back in the text to complain. He complains to God. It isn't fair. My punishment is greater than I can bear. It's always God's fault in these matters, isn't it? But not so, says God, because if anybody takes vengeance on you, Cain, I'm going to repay the perp 7 times over. And Cain, I'm going to put a mark on you. I'm going to brand you like a sheep or a cow, so that everybody out there in that land will know that you belong to me. And then God blesses him. God says, and Cain, nevertheless, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Cain, complaining about getting what he deserves, is set apart, marked, and blessed. Can you believe it? That's how this story ends, not with a curse, but with a blessing. Cain, you, me, who deserve to be clobbered for our sin, instead gets clobbered with blessing. A parable is told of an old rancher out in the American Wild West, a mean, despicable old man of a rancher. And one day, one of his poor, underpaid cowboys rustles a cow from him. And the rancher finds out about it, and he has the cowboy dragged in front of him. He makes the cowboy kneel in front of him. He looks down at him and said, "You stole one of my cows? Hang him. That will teach him a lesson." Some years later, that mean old rancher died, and he stood before God's throne, quaking in his boots as he thought about all the ugly things he had said and done and manipulated in his life. And God looks down at him and says, "Forgive him. That'll teach him a lesson." The real hero of today's story is God. Because it's not just a story about sin and violence and murderous brothers. It's a greater story about grace. How God is amazingly always willing to take even our murderous, sinful, tooth-clawed viciousness and nevertheless weave us into his purpose and plan. Again and again and again, starting here, the Bible will tell us and teach us that God's grace will never be stumped or stopped by our sin, not even Cain's murder. The same God who loved little Abel, wonder of wonders, finds a place in his great heart even for the murderous Cain, and will even bless him into a great nation. It's not, first of all, a story of how we need to take on envy and try harder to be courageous in our determination to serve God and neighbor. No, it's first of all a story of God's amazing courage and determination to save murderous sinners even like us. No evil we can commit is beyond God's power to redeem. In fact, this is how determined God will be. God will send a second Adam to do what the first Adam couldn't, and that was to remain focused and sinless and devoted, a perfect role model. And that second Adam, Jesus, lived among us just like a brother and loved us like a brother. But this Jesus, our brother, didn't kill us. Get this. Our brother dies for us. And on Easter morning, God raised that brother who was slain, whose blood had been crying out the ground for centuries. And we are saved by that brother. If that isn't amazing, well, then I don't know what is. Amen.